This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider. Until he quit, Professor Neil Ferguson was one of the leading coronavirus experts on the government's SAGE advisory panel. His loss from that is significant. But in the opening question to Boris Johnson for their first ever PMQs encounter, Labour's new leader Sir Keir Starmer wasn't interested in why one of the creators of the lockdown rules had broken his own guidelines to meet his lover. During this pandemic, there are bigger issues to deal with.
At least 29,427 people in the UK have now lost their lives to this dreadful virus. That's now the highest number in Europe. It's the second highest in the world. That's not success, or apparent success. So can the Prime Minister tell us, how on earth did it come to this?
At every stage as we took the decisions that we did, we were governed by one overriding principle and aim, and that was to save lives and to protect our NHS. And I believe that, of course, there will be a time to look at what decisions we took and whether we could have taken different decisions.
Shortly after, the Prime Minister also announced a new target for 200,000 tests a day by the end of this month. The battle against COVID-19 goes on without Professor Neil Ferguson, but our editorial column is concerned an expert with his knowledge can be lost so easily at a time when they're so needed.
Professor Neil Ferguson resigned, and you can see why. It's the usual way to manage a story like this. But the consequences are absurd. His knowledge remains vital, but because he met his lover when he shouldn't have done, he will not be able to explain himself in person when SAGE meets. Early on in the crisis, Scotland's Chief Medical Officer, Catherine Calderwood, also had to resign after making 2 trips to her second home. Lots of people got cross, and it was an idiotic thing to do. But is Scotland safer because she went? Surely not. Is Britain safer because Professor Ferguson has resigned? Definitely not. Flawed people who do foolish things can still offer good advice. Losing Professor Ferguson from SAGE now, as plans are being made to ease rules, is madness.
The Evening Standard's Associate Editor Julian Glover is with me over the phone now. And Julian, is there any way Neil Ferguson could have held on to his job after breaking the rules that the public has to follow?
We're very good in Britain at rushing around sometimes, demanding people resign from a job, and then forgetting why they resigned at all. And I think that's what's going to happen with Neil Ferguson, except this time it's even more important. He's the guy who's been helping shape the government's approach to coronavirus. He's the person who warned that deaths would spiral to some extraordinary height, the NHS would be overwhelmed. He's the one who really triggered the government decision to go into lockdown. He didn't take the decision himself, but his modelling, his advice, was the thing that tipped us into it. And it turns out he's sort of broken lockdown, as it's been reported in different newspapers today.
Yes, the lockdown that you and I, the general public, have to follow. Isn't this all a bit one rule for you and one rule for me, Julian?
But I don't think that's the big issue. There are 2 things we need to worry about and ask ourselves. 1, has he provided the right advice? And 2, does him staying in his post help us fight coronavirus and get through this quicker? Well, on 1, the balance of probability is he did. Not everybody agrees. History will have to judge it in the future, but we can't say for sure. Certainly, this isn't a time to stop taking his advice just because we're not sure about it. 2, does his staying in the job make a difference? Yes, it must do. The government's about to make decisions on how it wants to get out of lockdown. We're going to get a speech by the Prime Minister. This is the moment to have the advice of the people who helped shape the policy from the start involved. Instead, we've got this really absurd situation. He's going to keep doing research. He's going to keep leading the Imperial College work as he should, but he's not going to be allowed to sit on the SAGE committee, the key body that debates and discusses different aspects of science and advises the government. He's not going to be there because twice his lover visited him in his house during lockdown. No one was actually infected, but it was an obvious breach of the rules. It was really stupid, and he's said that. He obviously regrets doing it. So do other people who've done things that break the rules. Some of them around government. We've seen people not socially distancing in photographs. Well, we've just got to get over that and get on with it.
So where does this leave the government's coronavirus strategy? I mean, he wasn't the only scientist working with them. Now that he's resigned very, very quickly, do they just move on?
Him standing down might shut the story down for a day, but the long-term consequences won't be great. I wish we didn't keep having these moments in Britain when people suddenly have to resign for things and we can't remember why. Sometimes the people who should resign don't. In the end, we'll judge Ferguson by whether he got his advice right and the decisions from it were right. We won't know that for a long time, by which point we'll have forgotten everything about whether somebody came round to see him in his house a few weeks ago.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.